Well, hello everyone. This video today is for IB Theory of Knowledge, Skyline High School 2019-2020. And it's the week 12 video. So this week we are starting to get into our transition from the ways of knowing to the areas of knowledge. And to do that, we're looking at the transition that Lodgemont makes as well as the Oxford book. Today, I'm going to focus more on the Oxford book and kind of a summary of this portion of it. But this is the point of the class where we can kind of like stop and reflect, right? We can reflect upon what we've learned about 8 ways of knowing, as well as remind ourselves about things like, say, knowledge questions, right? So the book goes back to the metaphor that it went into at the very beginning, where it talked about like standing on a hill and looking at what's coming up. So at this time, we've covered 8 ways of knowing, and we're about to jump into covering 8 areas of knowledge. So it raises a lot of questions, right? We ask knowledge questions like, how do ways of knowing contribute to personal knowledge and shared knowledge? And how do ways of knowing provide justification for knowledge claims? We've spent weeks now covering the ways of knowing and trying to prepare to answer questions like this. So the same sorts of questions are going to guide us into our next phase, the areas of knowledge. We've been making some subtle connections and comparisons of the ways of knowing with each other. More specifically, we should examine the ways in which the ways of knowing interact with each other. So, like, for instance, how does imagination end up interacting with memory, for instance, or reason? We examine the ways of knowing in which ways of knowing interact within a context. Examine how our areas of knowledge give us knowledge of our ways of knowing. Examine how our ways of knowing build areas of knowledge in terms of classification and concepts. How ways of knowing build areas of knowledge in terms of methodology, and examine how ways of knowing and areas of knowledge interact within a given context. It's very useful for us to share terminology, like, for instance, System 1 and System 2. Look at the ceiling real quick and see if you can remind yourself which one was System 1, which one was System 2, right? When I use terms like sense perception or intuition at this point, I hope that you have in mind the kind of things that I do now. You should note that our ways of knowing intersect with each other and interact like memory and sense perception. The way of knowing wheel is not static, it's dynamic. Think about the way that reason interacts with sense perception, trying to name animals when you're a child, for instance. When we use our ways of knowing, we use them somewhere in the world, in a real context, alive with different perspectives. So, how do memories and emotions intersect, for instance? Language, of all the ways of knowing, is probably the most rooted in culture. So, too, though, could be faith, right? And of course, we know about the variety of different cultures that we can see. To what extent are our ways of knowing influenced by, say, nature or nurture, right? Let me remind you, we don't really control either of these. The book tells a story about a man who left the West to learn Japanese, and he mentions that it made him a lot more patient. Our areas of knowledge can certainly give us understanding of our ways of knowing. Recent research, of course, has contributed much to the book that we've been going over. Cultural studies and political science have given us information that we used in Chapter 1. Of course, the treatment of truth in Chapter 3 owes a lot to philosophy, of course. Perhaps more than any other, science has given us information about our ways of knowing. The cognitive sciences, like psychology and sociology, have given us much in terms of information about how the brain works, for instance. What influence does culture have on what you understand or what you know? Can your culture even influence what you end up sensing with your sense perception? Remember, we talked about confirmation bias, for instance. We construct our areas of knowledge, of course, using our ways of knowing, and it's helpful to remind ourselves of this before we get into our area of knowledge section. So, one of the most basic ways in which we know is through classification. The linguist George Lakoff especially emphasized linguistics, suggesting that nothing is more basic than categorization to our thought, our perception, our action, and our speech. Every time we see something as a kind of thing, we are categorizing. How we classify our ideas in language, then, has a major impact on how we build our different areas of knowledge. Classification means a lot to people. In what ways do you think you could be classified? Do you think that those categories are fair, or sometimes do you feel like people categorize you in the wrong sort of way? Do you often find yourself categorizing other people? Are your categories based on observation? In what ways are they useful? In what ways can your categorization be misleading, though, or not useful? Classification based on observation is basic to our being able to tell the difference between a rock and a tree, right? Some of the greatest undertakings in knowledge have resulted from our attempts to classify the entire world, or like, for instance, in the case of Aristotle, not even the world, but beyond that, what's called metaphysics, or Carl Linnaeus in his Species Plantarum and Systema Naturae. Linnaeus was able, for instance, to categorize whales as animals, mammals, for instance, right? Something that Aristotle would not have been able to do. The most remarkable thing about his system, though, was that it was open to change, and we could have these categories that could be open to change. What are the implications of categories, though? Some of the biggest political arguments that we have in contemporary culture are really rooted in categorization, right? Like, is it abortion or is it murder or something like that, right? Is someone a migrant or a refugee or a citizen or like an illegal alien, for instance, right? How do we categorize these things? The simple truth is that complexity defies categorization, and the universe is simply extremely complex. And this is part of why shortcuts to thinking or heuristics can be so problematic. Entire areas of knowledge deal with this sort of question. The human sciences and history inquire into how humans think and what behaviors they engage in. The arts deals with products of creativity, and ethics deals with morality, right? Actions could be categorized, for instance, as either virtuous and good or vicious and bad. What we need to constantly question are things like, is this classification accurate or is it fair, right? Our categories carry implications for how we think and act inside the real world. Scientific inquiry into the question of race in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, of course, eventually led to total disasters, right? There was all this scientific racism in the progressive era. What we've now discovered is that race doesn't really have biological reality the way that the progressives were suggesting that, and that racist categorization has fixed on certain human variables among many and attached to them value judgments and emotions. This kind of classification, though, of course, is resistant to change. As Ella Shaw had suggested, racism often travels in gangs accompanied by its buddies, sexism, classicism, and homophobia. Systems of social stratification thus get superimposed on each other. So this begs the question, right? What do we use for a definition in order to create certain categories? We need a framework. Clearly, our ways of knowing interact to give us much of our everyday knowledge as we classify, and give us much of our academic knowledge as we develop conscious classification systems or study socially constructed ones in the different areas of knowledge. How we use our ways of knowing in the different areas of knowledge is dependent upon their subject matter and their goals. What is it that the area of knowledge wants to do? What are the goals? Our area of knowledge may lie along a spectrum in their goals, from like subjectivity to objectivity. Keep in mind that the way of knowing used to create the knowledge in an area of knowledge might not necessarily be the same as are those evident in its communication or in its evaluation. Does perspective, for instance, influence your knowledge? And of course, the Dombrowski text is constantly reminding us of this perspectives sort of question, right? One of the basic things that the areas of knowledge have to do is they have to establish criteria for how they will decide what gets to be considered as part of the body of knowledge. After all, how we study ends up depending on what we are studying. We will look into methodologies in the next chapter. This is one of the best moments we could take to suggest that the IB way of knowing and area of knowledge framework could be different. In fact, they didn't have it the same way in years before, and they're going to change it in the future. Ways of knowing and areas of knowledge don't exist as physical entities in reality. They are concepts, and as such, that's how we study them. Finally, there's going to be a great interview at the end about politics in India. I'll let you enjoy that portion. But that takes us to our final questions. What are the advantages to discussion of knowledge gained by identifying and using 8 ways of knowing and 8 areas of knowledge? What are the advantages to discussion of knowledge gained by recognition that our way of knowing and area of knowledge wheel are simplified models? The text then takes a minute to introduce a fascinating section, an inquiry into whether or not I should believe any particular knowledge claim. It takes an approach called the 3 S's: source, statement, and self. First of all, is the source of the knowledge claim. What sorts of questions should we ask of the source? Is it credible? Does the source belong to an organization that is seeking to achieve an agenda? Does the source claim to be a lone genius who is the only one in a field that will truly look at the evidence? Is the source consistent with other credible sources on the topic? Does the knowledge claim fail one of our basic truth checks? Remind yourself of the truth checks: coherence, correlation with reality, and pragmatism, right? Does the source provide ways to check the accuracy of their claims? Does the source have an obvious problem with confirmation bias? Do they have a clear reason not to want to see something? Is the source potentially a victim of memory decay? Do personal relationships get in the way of their objectivity? Second are the statements themselves. Why is this person making this type of knowledge claim right now? Is it related to a social issue that might cloud the topic? Can you sum up the knowledge claim into something more simple? Does the statement fall victim to any clear logical fallacies? What is the goal of the statement? Does the statement give a description of the methodology that was used to derive it? Is the methodology good? Is it credible? Are there any contradictions with inside the knowledge claim? Does it contradict reality? Is there emotional involvement? Is the claim relevant? Does it sound too good to be true? And of course, most of the time, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is not true. Is a particular perspective really important? Does it offer guaranteed results or something like that? Third is the self. What features of my own perspective might influence my understanding of the statements, limiting it, biasing it, or deepening it? Am I inclined to believe this for a particular reason? Can I keep an open mind in relation to this topic? How relevant is my own experience in the field being discussed? Am I distracted by features of the source, right? Is the source particularly attractive or not attractive? Or am I inclined to like their accent or their language or something like that, right? Do I have a responsibility to know something about this topic? Interestingly, the book doesn't offer us any answers to any of these questions, but it's a good idea to keep many of them in mind. So finally, we're going to get to the part of the book where it's going to go into inquiry into the methodology for the areas of knowledge. The book pretty well goes over the description for the reasons why it's going about the process it's going about, only to suggest that, of course, what really matters is your own sense of purpose and your own interpretation of the knowledge. The book set out to guide students for how they can become the type of person it is that the IB profile is suggesting that a person should be, right? So you're open-minded, you're an inquirer, and you're open to the idea that acquiring knowledge creates responsibility, which is why you have to do your CAS stuff. The overall aim of the Theory of Knowledge course is to encourage students to formulate answers to the question, how do you know that? In a variety of contexts, and of course, see the value of that question. What a powerful question. How do you know that? This allows students to develop an enduring fascination with the richness of knowledge. More specifically, these are a bunch of the other objectives for the course. Take a moment to reflect honestly. What are your goals for your education? What do you want to get out of this whole thing, right? What knowledge is the most important for you to gain? What is the place of the IB in your own learning? Or where do you want to go in life? This course is a very different one from much of the rest of your education. It's attempting to be much more holistic. In what ways do you think this course contributes to your personal development in your life ahead? The areas of knowledge ahead are all shared knowledge, but shared knowledge is a concept we have to revisit before we move on. Our community shapes what we know, and what we know can end up shaping our community as well. Knowledge is shared by groups that are large and small, from football players to Arctic explorers to women, and so on and so on. It's not really our interest in how many people share a particular piece of knowledge. Our focus is to examine what the knowledge is, how it's made, and how that knowledge is shared. What is the nature of the knowledge that is shared? What are the methods by which it is constructed? What are the methods by which it becomes shared knowledge inside of a group? How do people exchange ideas? Keep in mind, it's not only through language. What are some of the problems with how ideas are shared? Are ideas ever really communicated across perfectly? To facilitate the discussion of areas of knowledge, the TOK book gives a structure that identifies 5 components of areas of knowledge. The framework between areas, therefore, easily leads to comparison. How does the use of language, for instance, in science, compared to the use of language in ethics? The framework used is not comprehensive. Other aspects of areas of knowledge could be discussed, but the focus is limited here due to the amount of time that we will take to discuss them. We will continue to use our methods despite knowing that other methods could be used. So here's the 5-part framework that we're putting together. Number 1 is the scope. What distinguishes this area of knowledge from the others? What does this area of knowledge study? Think about it for a second. How would you answer the question? What does math study? What does history study? What does religion study? Number 2 is concepts and language. What are the central concepts of this area of knowledge, and what type of language is used? So think for a second. What is a concept inside natural sciences? What does the language mean when used in the context of studying this field, right? The word theory, for instance, right? We'll note that the word theory inside of science is different than some of the other areas of knowledge. 3 is methodology. How does this area of knowledge inquire into knowledge, and how does it create and exchange knowledge? 4 is the historical development. How has this area of knowledge changed over time? And learning about those changes is sometimes very educational about learning about the field in general. And then 5 is links to your own personal knowledge. What does this area of knowledge contribute to your own personal knowledge? After inquiry into each of these areas of knowledge, you'll have a chance to consider how knowledge works. So let's get started. Your forum posts are due this upcoming Friday. Good luck, everyone.